I thought losing my father would be the hardest day of my life. I was wrong. The hardest part was discovering that the people who shared his last name had already decided I no longer belonged to the family. My name is Ethan Carter, and on the morning of my father's funeral, I drove nearly 400 miles across 2 states with one goal in mind. I wanted 5 quiet minutes to stand beside his casket, say goodbye, and keep a promise I had made to him years earlier. The July sun was already heating the blacktop as I pulled into the church parking lot just outside Columbus, Ohio. Every parking space was full. Expensive sedans lined both sides of the driveway, and men in dark suits stood in small circles speaking softly, while women carried white lilies toward the entrance. I had imagined this moment 100 times during the long drive. I pictured walking through the church doors, seeing familiar faces, maybe exchanging a silent nod with relatives I had not spoken to in years. Instead, the very second I stepped onto the sidewalk, my younger half-brother Ryan spotted me. His expression hardened, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He walked straight toward me before I could even reach the front steps. "You need to leave," he said without lowering his voice. Conversations nearby stopped. Several heads turned in our direction. I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. "I'm here for Dad," I answered quietly. "So am I." Ryan folded his arms. "Dad wouldn't have wanted you here." Before I could respond, the heavy church doors opened again. Margaret Carter, my father's second wife, stepped outside wearing a black dress and oversized sunglasses. She looked at me for only a second before shaking her head. "I told you he might show up," she said to Ryan as though I were not standing 10 feet away. Then she faced me directly. "You are not welcome here, Ethan." The words landed harder than I expected. I had not spoken to Margaret in almost 3 years, but even after everything that had happened between us, I never imagined she would try to stop me from attending my own father's funeral. "I just want to say goodbye," I said. "Nothing more." Margaret's voice remained calm, almost rehearsed. "Goodbye was something you should have said while he was alive." That sentence spread through the crowd like a spark catching dry grass. I noticed strangers exchanging sympathetic looks with Margaret instead of me. They did not know the truth. They only knew the version she had spent years telling. That I had abandoned my father. That I had disappeared when he became sick. That I had chosen my career over my family. None of it was true, but lies repeated often enough began to sound like memories. I took another step toward the entrance anyway. Ryan moved sideways, blocking the path. A church security volunteer noticed the confrontation and walked over. Ryan pointed directly at me. "He isn't invited." Invited. The word echoed in my head. Since when did a son need an invitation to attend his own father's funeral? I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and touched the folded piece of paper I had carried the entire drive. It was the last birthday card my father had mailed me. I had read it so many times that the edges were beginning to wear thin. He had written, "No matter what anyone says, you will always be my son." I wanted to believe those words still mattered. I looked past Ryan through the open church doors. At the front of the sanctuary, surrounded by white flowers, I caught my first glimpse of my father's casket. It was only for a second before someone closed the doors again, but it was enough to tighten my chest. I had made it 400 miles, and I was less than 50 feet away from saying goodbye. Yet that distance suddenly felt impossible to cross. Ryan leaned closer and lowered his voice just enough so only I could hear. "Walk away now before you embarrass yourself even more." I looked around at the silent faces watching every second unfold. Some pitied me. Others judged me. None of them knew that within the next hour, everything they believed about the Carter family was about to change. For a long moment, nobody moved. The church bell rang once in the distance, announcing that the service was about to begin, but every eye near the entrance remained fixed on me. Margaret slowly turned toward the guests and sighed as though carrying a burden she had endured for years. "I hoped today would be peaceful," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Your father deserved that much." Her words were carefully chosen. She never accused me directly. She simply allowed everyone else to reach the conclusion she wanted them to reach. A gray-haired woman standing near the flower arrangements whispered something to the man beside her. Another guest looked at me with disappointment instead of curiosity. Their expressions told me everything. They had already heard the story long before I arrived. Ryan shook his head with theatrical sadness. "He disappeared when Dad needed him most," he said. "Now he wants everyone to think he cared." The sentence spread through the crowd almost instantly. I heard pieces of it repeated only a few feet away. That is the son who left. Poor Mr. Carter. Can you imagine showing up after all these years? I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to tell them about the hundreds of phone calls that were never returned, about the letters that came back unopened, about the birthdays and holidays when I drove to this very house only to find the locks changed. But I also knew something about rumors. Facts rarely defeated stories that people already wanted to believe. Margaret stepped closer, lowering her sunglasses just enough for me to see her eyes. There was no grief in them, only confidence. She believed she had already won. You should leave with what little dignity you have left, she said quietly. Everyone inside knows exactly what kind of son you were. I looked past her again toward the church. Through the stained glass windows, I could see shadows moving as people took their seats. Somewhere inside was my father. Whether he had believed the lies or not, I would never have the chance to ask him now. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Ethan. I turned and saw my cousin Olivia walking across the parking lot carrying a small bouquet of white roses. For just a second I felt hope. We had been close as children before the family slowly drifted apart. She stopped a few feet away, looking uncertain. I did not know you were coming, she said. Before I could answer, Ryan spoke first. He came to make a scene. Olivia glanced from Ryan to Margaret before looking back at me. Her face revealed hesitation. She wanted to believe someone, but she did not know who deserved that trust. Is that true? She asked softly. I swallowed the frustration building inside me. I came to say goodbye to Dad. That is all. Margaret immediately answered before Olivia could respond. That would sound believable if he had visited his father even once during the last 3 years. More heads nodded. The lie had become accepted history. I realized then that this had not happened overnight. It had taken years of careful conversations, selective truths, and convenient omissions to erase me from my own family. Every absent chair at Thanksgiving, every missed Christmas, every birthday I supposedly ignored had been transformed into proof that I no longer cared. No one knew how many times I had stood outside my father's house watching lights through the windows because nobody answered the door. No one knew how many voicemail messages remained unanswered. No one knew how often I had wondered whether my father even received them. The security volunteer shifted uncomfortably before speaking. Sir, I really need to ask you to leave the property if the family does not want you here. His tone was polite, but firm. He believed he was protecting grieving relatives from an unwanted disturbance. I could not blame him. He had only heard one version of the story. My fingers tightened around the birthday card inside my jacket. For the first time during the morning, I questioned whether I should simply walk away. Maybe saying goodbye from the parking lot was better than turning my father's funeral into a public argument. Maybe this was exactly what he would have wanted. As I took one slow step backward, the church choir began singing inside the sanctuary. The familiar hymn drifted through the closed doors, making the distance between me and my father feel greater than 400 miles. It felt impossible. Ryan smiled faintly, believing the confrontation was over. Margaret adjusted the sleeve of her dress and started walking back toward the entrance with quiet satisfaction. The guests slowly followed her inside, convinced they had witnessed the final chapter of a disappointing son's return. Within moments, I was standing almost completely alone in the parking lot, watching the church doors close once again, unaware that before the first prayer of the service could even begin, an unexpected arrival was already turning onto the long driveway leading toward the church. I remained where I was long after the church doors had closed. The choir's voices drifted through the stained glass windows, softened by the thick wooden walls, reminding me that every passing minute was another moment of my father's farewell that I would never get back. I glanced toward my truck parked beneath a large maple tree at the edge of the lot. Part of me wanted to get inside, start the engine, and disappear before anyone else could look at me with pity. Another part refused to leave. I had promised my father years ago that no matter what happened between the rest of the family and me, I would always come when he needed me. Even if I was too late to hear his voice one last time, I could not bring myself to break that promise now. I walked slowly across the parking lot until I reached a stone bench overlooking the church entrance. From there I could see people through the narrow glass panels whenever the doors opened briefly. They hugged one another, shared quiet memories, and entered the sanctuary without hesitation. I wondered how many of them believed I had abandoned the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle, coached my Little League games, and stayed awake all night, helping me finish science projects when I was a kid. It was strange how an entire lifetime of love could be erased by a story repeated often enough. My phone vibrated inside my pocket. For one hopeful second I imagined it might be Olivia. Instead, it was another missed call notification from work, followed by a message asking whether I needed additional bereavement leave. I stared at the screen before locking it again. None of that mattered anymore. Across the parking lot, I noticed Olivia step outside alone. She looked around until her eyes found me sitting on the bench. She hesitated before walking over, carefully making sure no one from the family was watching. "I wanted to ask you something," she said quietly as she sat several feet away. "Did you really never visit Uncle Thomas?" Hearing my father's first name spoken aloud tightened something inside my chest. I looked toward the church before answering. I tried more times than I can count. Olivia studied my face, searching for signs that I was lying. "Margaret always said he refused to see you because you stopped caring." I reached into my wallet and carefully removed an old gas station receipt folded around several faded visitor badges from Riverside Medical Center. They were dated over different months spanning nearly 2 years. "These are from the hospital," I said. "Every visit I was allowed before someone removed my name from the approved visitor list." Olivia took one badge, reading the printed date without saying a word. After that, I kept calling. I kept writing. I even drove here on Christmas Eve one year, but nobody answered the door. She looked genuinely confused now. Why would they tell everyone something different? Before I could answer, the church doors opened again. Ryan stepped outside carrying his phone. The moment he saw Olivia sitting beside me, irritation flashed across his face. He marched toward us without hesitation. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Olivia stood. "I was just talking to Ethan." Ryan glanced at the hospital badges still in her hand before quickly snatching them away. He barely looked at them before crumpling them in his fist. "You cannot believe everything he shows you," he said. He has always known how to manipulate people. I could see Olivia struggling between years of family loyalty and the evidence she had just seen. She handed me the remaining badges without another word and quietly walked back toward the church, leaving us alone once again. Ryan watched her disappear inside before turning toward me. "You should have left when I gave you the chance." His voice had lost the false sadness from earlier. Now it carried only irritation. "Everyone inside thinks this is over." I looked directly at him. "Is that what you are afraid of?" "That it is not." His jaw tightened. For the first time that morning, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. It lasted only a second before he forced another confident smile. "Nothing is going to change today." Without waiting for my response, he walked back toward the entrance. Just before opening the door, he looked over his shoulder one final time, almost as though he wanted to make certain I was still outside. The church fell quiet again. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the parking lot as I lowered my eyes to the worn birthday card still resting in my hand. I unfolded it once more, tracing my father's familiar handwriting with my thumb. Beneath the message I had memorized years ago, I noticed something I had somehow overlooked before. In the lower right corner, squeezed into the margin, my father had written 6 small words that suddenly refused to leave my mind. "Trust Daniel if anything happens to me." I whispered the name to myself, trying to remember who Daniel was, when at that exact moment the distant sound of tires crunching across the gravel driveway echoed through the silent church grounds, drawing every head inside and outside toward a black sedan slowly approaching the front entrance. The black sedan rolled to a smooth stop directly in front of the church entrance, its polished finish reflecting the bright Ohio sun. It was not the kind of vehicle that drew attention because it was expensive. It drew attention because it arrived nearly 20 minutes after the funeral service had already begun, and whoever stepped out did so with the quiet confidence of someone who expected to be there. The driver's door opened first, followed by the rear passenger door. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit climbed out, carrying a slim black leather briefcase. His silver hair was neatly combed, and every movement appeared calm and deliberate. He looked neither rushed nor uncertain. Instead of entering the church immediately, he paused and surveyed the parking lot as though searching for someone. I remained seated on the stone bench, watching from a distance. The name written inside my father's birthday card echoed again in my thoughts. "Daniel." The stranger took several measured steps before asking the church security volunteer, "Excuse me, Could you please tell me where I can find Ethan Carter? The volunteer looked surprised by the question and instinctively pointed toward me. The man nodded politely before walking across the parking lot. With every step he took, I felt an unexpected sense of recognition, although I could not immediately remember where I had seen him before. He stopped a few feet away and extended his hand. "Mr. Carter?" he asked. I stood and shook it. "Yes." His expression softened. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I represented your father for many years." My heartbeat quickened. "You knew my father?" "Very well," he answered. "He asked me to find you personally if certain circumstances ever occurred." Before I could ask another question, the front doors of the church opened once again. Several guests had noticed the unfamiliar sedan and stepped outside to see what was happening. Ryan emerged first, followed closely by Margaret. The moment Ryan recognized the man standing beside me, the confidence I had seen all morning disappeared from his face. He walked quickly toward us. "Mr. Brooks," Ryan said with forced politeness. "The service has already started. We were wondering if you got delayed." Daniel turned calmly toward him. "I arrived exactly when I intended to." Margaret approached with an uneasy smile. "We are grateful you could make it. We have already begun the memorial." Daniel acknowledged her with a courteous nod, but made no effort to enter the church. Instead, he looked directly at me again. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for the delay. I had to retrieve several documents from my office before coming here." Ryan interrupted almost immediately. "Whatever paperwork there is can wait until after the funeral." Daniel remained completely composed. "Actually, it cannot." The parking lot grew noticeably quieter. Even guests standing near the entrance stopped speaking. Margaret folded her hands together. "Surely this is not the appropriate time." Daniel opened his briefcase just enough to remove a sealed cream-colored envelope. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were only 4 words. "For my son Ethan." Seeing those words felt like hearing my father's voice after years of silence. I stared at the envelope without reaching for it. Daniel continued speaking in the same measured tone. "Your father left very specific legal instructions regarding today's service. He instructed me that if Ethan Carter was not present inside the church before the memorial officially began, I was to intervene immediately." Ryan laughed nervously. "There must be some misunderstanding." Daniel looked at him without raising his voice. "There is no misunderstanding." Margaret took one careful step forward. "Thomas wanted a peaceful service." "He did," Daniel replied, "which is precisely why he left detailed written instructions instead of relying on assumptions." The silence became almost uncomfortable. More guests slowly gathered outside, sensing that something important was unfolding. I noticed Olivia standing near the doorway, watching every word with growing curiosity. Daniel removed a second sealed document from the briefcase, this one bearing the embossed seal of his law office. "Your father anticipated that emotions might interfere with his final wishes," he said. "Therefore, he required me to verify that those wishes were respected before any further portion of today's memorial continued." Ryan's expression shifted from confidence to concern. "This is ridiculous. The funeral has already started." Daniel gently closed his briefcase and looked toward the church entrance. "Then I am afraid the service has begun without complying with your father's legally documented instructions." Several guests exchanged confused glances. Whispers spread through the crowd. Margaret attempted another reassuring smile, but it looked strained now. "Surely whatever this is can be handled privately." Daniel shook his head once. "Your husband was exceptionally clear. He specifically instructed that if Ethan Carter had been prevented from attending, I was to address the matter immediately and in the presence of the family." As the realization slowly spread across every face outside the church, I looked again at the envelope bearing my father's handwriting. For the first time that day, I understood that my father had expected this exact moment long before any of us had arrived, and whatever he had left behind was about to change far more than who was allowed to attend his funeral. No one spoke for several long seconds. Even the choir inside the sanctuary had fallen silent, leaving only the distant hum of the air conditioning units and the rustling leaves above the church parking lot. Daniel Brooks carefully held the cream-colored envelope in both hands before looking directly at me. "Your father instructed me that this letter was to remain sealed until I confirmed it was being delivered into your hands personally. He offered it to me with quiet respect. My fingers trembled slightly as I accepted it. The familiar handwriting across the front brought back memories I had spent years trying to protect. For just a moment, it felt as though my father had reached across time to speak one last time. Daniel nodded once. He also left written instructions regarding what should happen next. You may read the letter now if you wish. Margaret stepped forward before I could respond. Thomas was emotional near the end, she said with an uneasy smile. I do not think it is appropriate to make legal decisions in the middle of a funeral. Daniel met her eyes without changing his calm expression. These are not emotional decisions, Mrs. Carter. They are formal written instructions prepared months before your husband's passing. Ryan folded his arms tightly across his chest. My father already discussed everything with the family. Daniel answered immediately. He discussed some matters. He documented others. The documented instructions take legal precedence. A murmur spread through the gathered guests. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. The confidence Margaret and Ryan had displayed all morning was beginning to fade, replaced by visible discomfort. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly folded sheet of cream stationery bearing my father's unmistakable handwriting. My eyes immediately found the first line. Ethan, if you are reading this outside the church instead of inside beside me, then exactly what I feared has happened. I stopped breathing for a moment. Daniel quietly waited while everyone else remained completely silent. I continued reading. My son, I know you will blame yourself for not being closer during my final years, but you must not. There are many things you do not yet know, and I prayed that I would live long enough to explain them myself. If I did not, then Daniel will help you understand everything in the proper order. The words blurred slightly as my eyes filled with emotion. I forced myself to continue. Before anything else happens today, I want one final request honored. My funeral is not to continue unless Ethan Carter is standing inside this church as my son, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as my eldest child. Daniel finally spoke after allowing me enough time to finish the page. There is an additional document. He removed another sealed folder from his briefcase. This contains your father's formal funeral directives, signed before 2 witnesses and notarized under Ohio law. He opened the folder carefully and read aloud in a clear, steady voice. In the event that my son Ethan Carter is denied access to my funeral for any reason whatsoever, all memorial proceedings are to stop immediately until he is welcomed inside. This instruction reflects my personal wishes and accompanies the administration of my estate. Gasps quietly spread through the crowd. Olivia covered her mouth in disbelief. An elderly uncle I barely recognized slowly removed his glasses and looked toward Margaret with obvious confusion. Ryan shook his head repeatedly. This cannot be right. Daniel calmly handed the notarized document toward him. You are welcome to examine the signatures. Ryan glanced at the pages, but did not take them. Margaret tried one final time to regain control of the situation. Thomas was under tremendous stress. He may not have fully understood what he was signing. Daniel's voice remained respectful but firm. I met with your husband on 4 separate occasions regarding these instructions. During each meeting, he demonstrated full legal capacity. Every document was properly witnessed and recorded. Another wave of whispers moved through the relatives. I noticed people who had avoided looking at me earlier now studying Margaret and Ryan instead. Their certainty was beginning to unravel. Daniel closed the folder and looked toward the church entrance. Your father anticipated that some people might attempt to prevent Ethan from attending today's service. That is why he left no room for interpretation. He turned back to me. Mr. Carter, before we proceed further, there is one final sentence your father instructed me to read exactly as written. Daniel unfolded a separate handwritten note and spoke slowly enough that every person standing outside could hear each word. If Ethan arrives alone, believe him before you believe anyone else, because for years he has been carrying burdens that were never his to bear. The parking lot fell completely silent. I could see uncertainty spreading across faces that only minutes earlier had judged me without hesitation. Margaret lowered her eyes for the first time that morning. Ryan looked toward the church as though searching for an escape. Daniel gently closed the note before speaking one sentence that changed the atmosphere entirely. This letter is only the beginning. Your father instructed me that once Ethan was inside the church, the full truth was to be revealed before a single word of the eulogy could continue. Daniel looked around the gathering one more time before speaking again. Thomas Carter instructed me that the next portion of his statement was to be shared in front of every family member present. He opened another folder inside his briefcase, revealing several neatly organized documents separated by colored tabs. He believed that truth should be witnessed, not whispered. The guests slowly moved closer without anyone asking them to. Even those who had already entered the sanctuary quietly stepped back outside after hearing there would be an announcement. I could feel dozens of eyes shifting between me, Daniel, Margaret, and Ryan. The balance of the morning had begun to change, but I still had no idea how far my father had planned ahead. Daniel removed the first document. This is a record of monthly payments made to Riverside Medical Center over the last 3 years. He handed copies to 2 older relatives standing nearby before continuing. Every payment toward Thomas Carter's treatment was made from one account. Ryan spoke quickly. That was Father's account. Daniel calmly shook his head. No, the account belonged to Ethan Carter. A wave of surprised whispers spread across the crowd. My stomach tightened. I had never expected anyone to know about those payments. My father had begged me to keep them private because he did not want anyone arguing about money while he was still alive. Daniel continued. These transfers averaged $3,200 each month. Some months were significantly higher depending on medical procedures. He paused just long enough for everyone to absorb the numbers. Margaret frowned. There must be a mistake. Daniel immediately produced another document. There is no mistake. These records were verified directly with the hospital billing department and attached to your husband's estate file months before his passing. Olivia looked toward me with growing disbelief. You paid all of that. I nodded quietly. Dad never wanted anyone else worrying about the bills. Another silence settled over the group. Daniel opened the next section of the folder. Thomas also instructed me to preserve copies of every cashier's check Ethan used to pay property taxes on the family home after Thomas became unable to work. Ryan stared at the paperwork before looking directly at me. Why would you do that without telling anyone? I answered honestly. Because it was never about proving anything. It was about helping Dad. Daniel gently placed another stack of papers onto the hood of the black sedan so several relatives could read them. There is more. He lifted a folder containing printed email exchanges. These are communications between Ethan and my office spanning nearly 3 years. He began reading selected portions. Please do not tell my father I am sending additional money. I do not want him feeling guilty. Another message followed. If there is anything Medicare does not cover, bill me directly. Then another. If Dad asks where the money came from, tell him it is taken care of. Olivia lowered her eyes. An elderly aunt quietly wiped tears from her face. The story they had believed all morning no longer matched the evidence in front of them. Daniel reached into his briefcase one more time and removed a small envelope containing several handwritten notes. Your father insisted these remain private until today. He unfolded the first note. Daniel, Ethan thinks I do not know what he is sacrificing. I know. I simply do not know how to thank him without creating more conflict in this family. My chest tightened as Daniel continued reading. He drives hundreds of miles to visit me. Sometimes he waits outside because he does not want to upset anyone. I see his truck from the window, even when he thinks I cannot. I closed my eyes for a moment. All those evenings I believed my father never knew I had come suddenly returned to me. He had known all along. Daniel read another sentence. If Ethan ever doubts whether I loved him, tell him this. Every mile he drove to see me reached my heart, even on the days we were never allowed to speak. Margaret slowly stepped backward, saying nothing. Ryan looked down at the pavement, avoiding every face around him. No accusation had been made against either of them. Daniel simply continued presenting the documents exactly as my father had instructed, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Guests who had refused to look at me earlier now offered quiet, apologetic expressions. One older gentleman walked over and gently placed a hand on my shoulder without saying a word. That simple gesture meant more than I expected. Daniel carefully gathered the papers back into their folders before closing the briefcase. Everything you have heard so far explains only how Ethan supported Thomas during his illness, he said. It does not explain why Thomas believed today's events might happen, nor does it address the instructions concerning his estate. He looked directly at me before speaking the sentence my father had planned for this exact moment. Thomas wrote that once the truth about Ethan's sacrifices had been established beyond question, I was to reveal who he entrusted with everything he spent the last 40 years building. Daniel rested his briefcase on the hood of the sedan one final time before removing a thick blue folder secured with 2 notarized seals. Every conversation in the parking lot stopped. Even those who had remained inside the church quietly gathered near the entrance, sensing that the most important part of my father's final instructions was about to begin. Daniel looked around the crowd before speaking in the calm, steady voice that had never once wavered that morning. Thomas Carter instructed me to make this announcement only after establishing the truth regarding Ethan's relationship with him. He believed that no one should hear the contents of his estate until there was no doubt about who had remained faithful to him. He carefully broke the first seal and unfolded the official documents. This is the final will and testament of Thomas Michael Carter, executed 8 months before his passing, witnessed by 2 independent parties, notarized, and filed according to Ohio law. Ryan immediately stepped forward. I already know what is in that will. Daniel glanced at him politely. You may know what you expected to be in it. What I will read today is what your father signed. The silence became almost overwhelming. Daniel adjusted his glasses and began reading. I leave my personal residence, including all land, buildings, and contents, to my eldest son, Ethan Carter. Several people gasped softly. Ryan stared at Daniel without blinking. Margaret's face lost all color. Daniel continued before anyone could interrupt. I leave my investment accounts, retirement savings, and ownership interest in Carter Industrial Supply to Ethan Carter, whom I trust to preserve the values upon which this family was built. Ryan finally found his voice. That is impossible. Daniel calmly turned another page. Your father anticipated that someone might question his intentions. Therefore, he included an explanatory statement. He read aloud. Property should follow responsibility. Wealth should follow character. My decision is not based on blood alone, but on actions witnessed over many years. Every sentence seemed to shift the atmosphere even further. People who had spent the morning comforting Margaret now quietly stepped away from her. Olivia looked toward me with tears forming in her eyes. Ethan, I had no idea. I barely heard her. I was still trying to process what Daniel was reading. My father had never spoken about money during our conversations. Every visit had been about family, memories, or simple everyday life. I had expected nothing from his estate because I never wanted anything except the chance to remain his son. Daniel reached another section. To my wife, Margaret, I leave the vehicle currently titled in her name and the personal belongings already in her possession. These gifts reflect my gratitude for years we shared together. Margaret swallowed hard as Daniel continued without pause. To my son, Ryan, I leave the college education that I already financed, the truck previously given to him, and my sincere hope that he will one day understand that integrity cannot be inherited. The words echoed across the parking lot. Ryan shook his head repeatedly. He would never write that. Daniel quietly lifted another handwritten page. Your father anticipated that reaction as well. He held up the original document for everyone nearby to see. This page was written entirely in Thomas Carter's own handwriting. He began reading. Ryan, if you are hearing these words with disappointment, ask yourself whether you sought my love or only what I owned. I prayed you would choose differently. Ryan looked away without answering. Daniel unfolded one final handwritten letter addressed to the entire family. Thomas requested that I read this before concluding the estate announcement. He cleared his throat. For years I watched Ethan carry responsibilities that should never have belonged to one person. He asked for nothing in return. He never demanded recognition. He never spoke badly about anyone, even when he had every reason to do so. If you were surprised by my decisions today, then you have not been paying attention to the kind of man he became. I felt every eye turned toward me again, but this time there was no judgment in those faces. There was understanding, sympathy, and, from several relatives, unmistakable regret. An older family friend stepped forward and quietly said, Your father was proud of you. Those 5 words struck me harder than anything else I had heard all morning. Daniel carefully closed the will before looking directly at the gathering. There is one final instruction that Thomas insisted be carried out before the memorial service resumes. He paused just long enough for everyone to focus on him. He wrote that Ethan Carter must be the first family member invited to stand beside his casket, because in his own words, no father should begin his final farewell without the son who never stopped showing up, even when no one else was willing to open the door. For several seconds, no one moved. The same people who had watched me with suspicion less than an hour earlier now stood in complete silence, unable to reconcile the stories they had believed with the truth my father had carefully preserved. Daniel closed the blue folder and stepped back, leaving the decision that followed entirely to the family. No one rushed toward me. No one argued anymore. The loud certainty that had filled the church entrance all morning had been replaced by something far more powerful. Shame. Olivia was the first to break the silence. She walked toward me slowly, tears running down her face before stopping only a few feet away. "Ethan," she whispered, "I am so sorry." She did not offer excuses or explanations. She simply reached out and hugged me for a brief moment. I should have asked questions instead of believing what I was told. I nodded gently. You were not the only one. One by one, several relatives followed her example. My uncle David removed his hat before extending his hand. "Your father talked about you more than I realized," he admitted quietly. "I wish I had called you myself." Another cousin apologized for never reaching out. An elderly neighbor who had known my father for decades looked me in the eyes and said, "He always smiled whenever someone mentioned your name." I understand why now. Their words did not erase the pain of the past few years, but they reminded me that truth has a way of finding people who are willing to listen. Across the parking lot, Margaret remained frozen near the church steps. She looked smaller somehow, not because anyone had insulted her or raised their voice, but because every confident story she had built had quietly collapsed under documented facts. Ryan stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, staring at the pavement. He seemed ready to argue, yet every document Daniel had presented had left no room for another version of events. Finally, Ryan looked toward me. "You could have told everyone," he said, his voice noticeably weaker than before. I shook my head. Dad asked me not to. He wanted peace while he was alive. Ryan swallowed without speaking again. Daniel stepped closer to him. "Your father wrote something specifically for you that I chose not to read publicly because he hoped you would reflect on it privately." He handed Ryan a sealed envelope. He believed every person deserves the opportunity to change. Ryan accepted it without opening it. For the first time that day, he did not look angry. He looked uncertain, as though he was beginning to realize that the greatest loss was never the inheritance. It was the years he could never reclaim with the father whose trust he had misunderstood. Margaret slowly approached me next. She stopped several feet away, unable to meet my eyes at first. When she finally looked up, her voice was almost unrecognizable. "Thomas never told me." She paused before trying again. "I did not know about the hospital bills." I answered honestly. "He never wanted you to feel indebted to anyone." She nodded slowly, absorbing words that carried no accusation. For several moments, neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to argue about because the truth no longer belonged to either side. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. Daniel glanced toward the church doors where the pastor had quietly waited without interrupting the proceedings. "I believe Thomas's final request should now be honored," he said. The pastor stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Ethan, your father asked that you be welcomed as his eldest son." He reached for the church door and held it open himself. This time no one blocked my path. No one questioned why I was there. As I walked toward the entrance, relatives instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path through the crowd. It was the exact opposite of how the morning had begun. Earlier, I had been treated like a stranger standing outside his own family. Now, every person present silently acknowledged where I belonged. I paused briefly before entering and looked back toward the parking lot. The black sedan remained exactly where it had stopped, almost as though it had been waiting for this single moment. Daniel gave me a quiet nod that required no words. Everything my father had planned was unfolding exactly as he intended. I stepped through the church doors, hearing them close gently behind me. The sanctuary that had once felt impossibly distant now stood completely open before me. White lilies surrounded the front of the room. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, and at the center rested my father's casket. Every guest remained standing in respectful silence as I slowly walked down the aisle alone, finally reaching the place where I should have been from the very beginning. I stopped beside my father's casket and rested my hand gently on the polished wood. Everything else disappeared. The whispers, the apologies, the legal documents, the years of misunderstanding all faded into silence. For the first time in a very long while, it felt as though it was only my father and me. I looked at the framed photograph beside the flowers. It showed him exactly as I wanted to remember him, standing on the front porch of the old farmhouse with that familiar smile that always appeared whenever we finished working together in the yard. I smiled through my tears. "I made it, Dad," I whispered softly. "I am sorry it took so long." The pastor quietly invited everyone to remain seated while he stepped away from the podium. Without another word, he gave me the privacy my father had requested. I reached into my jacket and unfolded the birthday card I had carried throughout the entire day. Then I placed it beside the bouquet of white lilies. "You told me I would always be your son," I said. I almost stopped believing it. "Thank you for making sure I never had to doubt it again." I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering Saturday mornings at the hardware store, fishing trips where we never caught much of anything, and the countless conversations during long drives across Ohio when my father taught me that character mattered more than comfort. Those lessons had carried me through years when recognition never came. Standing there, I realized something I had not understood before. My father had never been silent because he had forgotten me. He had been preparing one final opportunity to protect me after he was gone. When I stepped back from the casket, Daniel quietly approached and handed me one last envelope. "Thomas asked me to wait until you had your private goodbye before giving you this." I opened it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten page. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then you finally stood where I always wanted you to stand. I know today has been painful, but do not spend the years ahead trying to repay hurt with more hurt. Build something better instead. A family is remembered not for what it owns, but for how it forgives. If you inherit anything from me, let it be that." I read those final lines twice before folding the letter again. My father had every opportunity to leave behind anger, yet he had chosen peace. I understood then why he had instructed Daniel to present facts instead of accusations. He had wanted truth to heal, not to humiliate. The pastor returned to the front of the sanctuary and invited anyone who wished to share a memory. For several moments no one stood. Then, unexpectedly, Ryan slowly rose from his seat. Every face turned toward him. He remained silent for a long moment before speaking. "I spent years believing that being close to Dad meant receiving everything he owned," he said quietly. "Today I learned I never understood what he valued most." His voice trembled. "Ethan, I cannot change what happened, but I hope someday you will allow me the chance to become a better brother than I have been." He sat down without expecting an answer. A few moments later, Margaret also stood. She looked toward the front of the church before speaking softly. "Thomas always believed that truth eventually finds its way home. He was right." She lowered her head and returned to her seat. No dramatic confrontation followed. No one celebrated another person's embarrassment. The greatest consequence had already taken place. Everyone present now understood the difference between appearances and reality. After the memorial concluded, relatives gathered outside beneath the afternoon sun. This time they did not avoid me. They shared stories about my father, old photographs, and memories I had never heard before. Olivia promised to send copies of family albums she had kept for years. Uncle David invited me to dinner whenever I felt ready. Small gestures, perhaps, but they carried more sincerity than grand speeches ever could. Before leaving, I walked one last time to the black sedan where Daniel was preparing to drive away. "Thank you," I said. He smiled warmly. "Do not thank me. I only carried out your father's instructions." He paused before adding one final thought. "The greatest inheritance he left you was never written inside that will. It was the reputation you earned when nobody was watching." As I watched him drive away, I looked back at the church one last time. I had arrived that morning believing I had lost my father and my family on the same day. Instead, I left with something I never expected to recover. My father's faith in me had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to be heard. And as I started my truck for the long drive home, I realized that the road ahead no longer felt lonely, because the truth my father protected until his final goodbye would remain with me for the rest of my life.